The interesting thing about
So they keep holding the little puppy. Yeah. Oh yeah.
All right. We're off and running. Good morning, everybody. So, Pastor John is not here today. I think he's getting me back for being out a couple of weeks ago. So it's just me today. So thanks for being here on a Thanksgiving week. Appreciate it. So let's open up in prayer. Dear Lord, we ask for your blessing on the messages and your word that we're going to be discovering today. And we just ask you to bless the congregation here at Community of Hope. We seek you. We need you, Lord. And as we approach and think about the end of days, we just ask for your guidance in our lives and to keep us focused on the most important thing, which is you. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in our 5th of 6 weeks. We got one more class next week, so please join us for that last one. It'll be very interesting. But this week, we're talking about being in the season. So the whole time we've been talking about the end of times and biblically how that's portrayed in the Bible. But this week, we're going to focus very specifically on what Jesus said to look for in the end of times, and are we in the season of the end of days? So we're going to start out with a little video here that's going to kind of set this up.
Prophetic fulfillment number 1 is 1948. Let's establish 1948. That's when the end began. Okay, that began the end times. On May 14th, 1948, when the British mandate ended over Palestine, Jewish leader David Ben-Gurion announced Israel's independence, which was recognized immediately by President Harry Truman of the United States, and Israel was born again May 14th, 1948, in one day. This is prophetic fulfillment number 2. This is an absolute miracle that Israel wasn't just reborn. And by the way, when I say that Israel was reborn the second time, Israel has been dispossessed twice. They were dispossessed by the Babylonians in about 500 BC. 70 years later, they were miraculously reborn as a nation for the first time. The second time, they were reborn from all over the world in 1948. And that's what God said. I'm not just bringing you back from Babylon the way I did the first time. I'm bringing you back from all over the world. And that's what happened beginning in 1948, in one day when Israel became a nation.
So that's Pastor Jimmy Evans, and there's a reason that we're starting with that theme. And as you know from the very beginning of our sessions here, that we're talking about looking at the end of times from the pre-perspective, the pre-millennial perspective. If you believe in the post or the amillennial perspective, a lot of this may make less sense, but we believe that as we study this, most of the evidence biblically points to a pre-millennial tribulation period and end of days. So that's why 1948 is kind of the basis for starting. We have to understand that prophecy was fulfilled when the Israel people in the Jewish homeland was reconvened in 1948. So that's a very key. Let's look at a couple of verses that speak to that in the Bible, because everything we look at has to be biblically based. We're not looking at speculation. We're not looking at what man has created, but what God has created. Looking at Isaiah 11, verses 11 through 12. And it shall come to pass on that day, the Lord shall continue to apply his hand a second time to acquire the rest of his people, that will remain from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Samaria and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea. And he shall raise a banner to the nations, and he shall gather the lost of Israel and the scattered ones of Judah. He shall gather from the four corners of the earth. Again, Isaiah 11. So that talks specifically to the regathering of the people and the reestablishment of the state of Israel, which happened to happen, as we saw it a second ago, in 1948. But it's not just one passage. In Jeremiah 29:14, and I will be found by you, says the Lord, and I will return your captivity and gather you from all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you, says the Lord, and I will return you to the place whence I exiled you. And then finally from Ezekiel 20, with a pleasing savor I shall accept you when I take you out of the nations, and I shall gather you from the lands in which you were scattered, and I shall be hallowed through you before the eyes of the nations. And you will know that I am the Lord when I bring you to the land of Israel, to the land that I lifted my hand to give to your forefathers. So some very interesting passages that all speak to thousands of years ago with the prophets about the coming of the state of Israel and the regathering that happened in 1948. We have to be really careful when we're studying prophecy because people can interpret prophecy in different ways, but I think that a lot of folks believe that that fulfillment is very, very important to the rest of the prophetic beliefs that we have. So that was fulfilled in 1948. Many may ask, okay, so what happens after 1948? There are a couple of Bible verses that I want to speak to that should give us pause to think. Again, I don't think we should look at this as fact. I think we should look at it as we pray and as we get inspiration from the Word. But a couple of things happen that are very interesting after that. Jesus, and we're going to talk more about the Olivet Discourse in just a second, very important from the Gospels, 3 of the Gospels. But Jesus, describing the end days, said, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away before all these things have happened." That's from Matthew 24, verse 34. The term generation is an interesting one because what Jesus is saying is when you start to see the signs of the times, when he gave the Olivet Discourse, he said you should pay special attention. You should be aware. You should be thinking about what's going on around you. When we talk about a generation, this is hotly debated. So I don't want to say that the science is out or that the word has been nailed down precisely, but we have to study what the word generation means to understand, are we living potentially in the end times? There are multiple places in the Bible where it talks about generations, where it talks about how long a generation is and how long a lifespan is. It varies very much between about 40 and 100 years. If you look at the books of Enoch and Jubilees, there's some specific references to that time frame being roughly 70 years. When you look at some of the other places in the Bible, it talks about when a man has his firstborn son, how long does it take before he passes? And that time frame between having a firstborn son and when that individual passes can be considered a generation. So it is debated how long that is, but most scholars, most biblical scholars, believe that time frame is between 40 and 100 years. There's one Psalm verse that I call your attention to at the bottom, which I think is interesting as well, and it says, "Our days may come to 70 years, or 80 if our strength endures." So what that's speaking to is that the average generation or lifespan could be 70 or 80 years if one has the genetic predisposition or the strength to live longer. So these are just guidelines, but when we apply a generation to, if we believe again that the prophetic clock began when Israel was regathered, it's not hard to do the math and to see that we're probably in that ballpark about when we should start to be paying very, very close attention. Interesting to say how quickly God can work as well. In the 1900s, in the land of Israel, there were just a few thousand Jewish people and settlers in that area. It was a very barren land, and they were starting to rebuild it because it had been pretty much destroyed. Today, there are over 7 million people living in that land. So very quickly, that was brought to pass, and the population there regathered. Watching for the signs. So the Olivet Discourse is a very important part of Jesus' gospel. The Olivet Discourse is described in 3 of the Gospels, in Matthew 24 and 25, in Luke 21, and in Mark 13. And the purpose of Jesus answering questions on the Mount of Olives to his disciples is the disciples were confused. And they wanted to understand, what did Jesus mean when he was talking about the end of days? And they wanted more direction, more clarity. So Jesus gave them a number of signs to be thinking about and looking for. I've listed a number of them here. We're going to dive into these in a little bit more detail, but it's watch for wars and rumors of wars from Matthew 24:6. The fact that sin in the world will become rampant and everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold from Matthew 24:12. That there will be natural disasters, earthquakes, pestilence, occurring from Luke 21. Looking to the stars and to the heavens for signs from the Lord from Luke 21:25. There'll be attempts to divide my land. We're going to get into the pressure that Israel is facing to divide their homeland and what the Lord says about that. And then we get into some very interesting things that I think are really signs of our times today, and that's advancements in technology. The pace in which technology is increasing and what technology can do in our lives. is both, and we're going to find this as we delve into this, both exciting and interesting, and also, quite frankly, just a little bit creepy. And we're going to get into that as well. The one world government, last week when we dove into Revelation in more detail, we talked about the one world government that the Antichrist ushers in, and then the cashless society that ushers in the mark of the beast, which again is that mark which identifies those that are following the Antichrist, not only from an economic perspective, but worship him as well. So the question we'll ask ourselves as we dive into a little bit more detail is, are we seeing any of these signs today? Let's watch a short little video that'll preview the wars and rumors of wars.
He says in verse 6, you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened.
The Iranian regime must know that if they continue to deceive the world, they will pay a heavy price.
Prophecy is God's newspaper telling you what's coming tomorrow so you have the information today.
So that's Pastor Tony Evans talking about how we should view prophecy, which I think is very interesting. And he's talking first about wars and rumors of wars. And I don't think you can look very far back in the history of our country to find wars that many probably believed were ushering in the end of times. I think you go back to the people that lived during the time of World War I and the devastation that that was creating, and maybe none more so than World War II, when millions of Jews were exterminated. Think about the people of those times and what they must have been thinking. They were probably thinking, this is it. This is the end of days. The Jews are being wiped out. The world is at war, and we should prepare ourselves. But, as we know, now looking back, that the end was not yet. And the question becomes, well, why was it not yet? Well, when we started just a few minutes ago, we talked about the fact that God had not regathered his people yet. So those could not have been the end of days because his people were still scattered amongst the land. When we look at specifically what the conflicts are that are going on today, we ask ourselves the question, are these prophetically significant? Are these things that could be ushering in the end of the days? And I think the two that are most prevalent on everybody's mind are what's going on in the Ukraine. Russia invading Ukraine, trying to regather some of that glory it had when it was part of the Soviet Union and had a much larger influence on the world. And so we look at what's going on there. As you recall, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Gog and Magog war. We'll talk about that in a second. But many believe that Russia is Magog as you look at the Gog and Magog conflict. So anytime Russia is involved in conflict, you have to kind of see, where is that heading? Where is that going? And what are they up to? And even more topical over the last month is that horrific terrorist attack in Israel where people were slaughtered and taken hostage. We're starting to see some hostages released right now, but what a horrific thing. Hamas is involved in that. We're going to talk about Hamas, Hezbollah, and some of those countries and groups around the borders of Israel and what significance they may play. The Bible talks about some involvement of Israel in conflicts and wars in the future that have prophetic and end days implications. The first is the Psalm 83 war, which is from Psalm 83, and that really describes a conflict where there's an alliance of 10 Arab nations, territories that share a border with Israel. And of course, when you go back and look at it, the names of those territories are different because that was thousands of years ago. But when you look at what those territories represented today, they are countries that are well known: Syria, Libya, other countries around us, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. But 10 alliances, 10 Arab alliances that get together and seek to destroy Israel and to wipe them off the map. So we're starting to see the precursor to that now as this conflict between Hamas and others that are influencing that process. What's really interesting is that the spread of anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. And when we see the hatred towards the Jewish people and the hatred towards Israel, and what we're going to talk about in a minute, the pressure for them to give up their land, we see that these things are all almost just lighting a match, getting ready for Israel becoming much more prophetically involved in what we believe happened during the end times. And then finally, the Gog and Magog war. We talked about that a while back from Ezekiel 38 and 39. That's a war during the end times involving, again, Russia, Turkey, Iran, a lot of the neighbors, in which they gather against to try to wipe out Israel, and God supernaturally intervenes and stops them. We think that probably is going to take place a little bit closer to the tribulation time frame, but as we're starting to see things heat up, things can go very quickly, so we need to pay attention. Should we be concerned we're in the end times right now? Perhaps, but Jesus says something that's very interesting when he's talking about wars and rumors of wars from Matthew 24:6. He says, see that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. So when he talks about the wars and the rumors of wars, hey, we're getting close, but it's not time quite yet. So maybe we should be paying attention, but not through fear, but through anticipation, because remember what we're focused on, which isn't what's going on in the world. Jesus on the Olivet Discourse also spoke of rampant sin and the love growing cold in the world. Boy, this one really struck me as I was preparing for this, because as we look at what's going on in society, we see something that is just horrific, which is this cheapening of the value of human life. And I think that's no more demonstrated than looking at three things. One is the prolific nature of sex trafficking that's going on, that we hear so much about today. The White House released a report in 2019, so it's probably even more today, that said 25 million people are estimated to be trapped in forced slavery, domestic servitude, and sex trafficking. What a horrific number, and that's happened over the last couple of decades. The increase in homicides, how many people are just sickened by the number of school shootings that we're experiencing today? The value of human life is just being degraded in this generation. Abortion, this is a hotly debated topic. A lot of people don't like to talk about it, but as Christians, I think we have to look at this squarely for what it is. 63 million abortions in the U.S. since Roe versus Wade was enacted. I don't think that's what God had in mind as far as what he wanted for his people. So that cheapening of the value of human life. The LGBTQ, it's always difficult for me to get all those letters out, lifestyle. We've seen over the last just probably 10 years a transition from recognizing that lifestyle to actually celebrating it. So again, as we look at God's word, God's perfect in what he does, and I'm sure that the Bible, and many of you have studied the Bible as it relates to this topic, are wondering what is going on when we've gone, not just from recognizing that people want to celebrate, or not recognizing that they want to practice that lifestyle, but we actually are now forced to celebrate it with gay pride weeks, pride flags, and so forth. Thank you. Month. Thank you, Steve. And how about the rise of transgenderism? That's something that really has been something just over the last year or two that we've really seen get a lot of notoriety, a lot of time in the press. Yes.
I think it's Romans 1:32, where God says, if you accept and condone immorality or sin, you're just as guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gender reassignment for young children, children that aren't able to think for themselves, haven't reached the age of maturity, development that they can make decisions, having decisions made for them. It's absolutely horrific. But again, I think it's a sign pointing to sin and the fact that our love for people has grown cold. And then the general moral decay and the normalization of sex out of wedlock. I mean, that's been around for quite some time, but it's now the norm. All the way down to, and again, I see this online, that there are now applications on people's cell phones that they can use to create hookups for one another. And that just shows to me, again, that moral decay that has progressed over the last number of years. So we have become a society that tends to accept and celebrate sinful behavior, as opposed to calling it out and repenting, which is what God calls us to do. And finally, a Gallup poll from 2021 showed that 47% of Americans rate our moral values as poor, and another 37% as only fair. So 85% of the people realize, hey, this is just who we are. We have poor and fair moral values. I think, needless to say, we can agree that we have lost our moral compass. Jesus also spoke of earthquakes, pestilence, and natural disasters. This statistic I found startling because this sneaks up on you. If it doesn't happen to you and it's just a news story, sometimes it's difficult to understand just how prevalent natural disasters have become. From the last 2 decades, from 2000 to 2019, 7,348 major natural disasters around the world, killing over 1 million people, resulting in about $3 trillion in economic damage. The previous 20 years prior to that, 4,212 natural disasters. We've seen a 74% increase in natural disasters from the previous 20 years. And this just last year, it's hit close to home for me. I'll speak about in a second, but the Moroccan earthquake that happened just this year, the fires in Hawaii, which we experienced, and flooding in Libya. These are increasing in intensity, in frequency, and as the Bible says, these are just the beginning of birth pains in Matthew 24, verse 7 and 8. I skipped over, but not to skip, the COVID pandemic. What a horrific couple of years that was, from the devastation it created to our healthcare system, to the devastation to our education system with the kids that miss school. They say a whole generation of kids are behind now in terms of their education, which is going to have ramifications for us going forward. So there is no doubt that earthquakes, pestilence, and natural disasters are on the rise as Jesus had foretold. This one was interesting to me. I had to actually do a little bit of research on this because I wasn't as familiar with what had been going on in the heavens. But I did find it interesting once I started digging into it a bit, and that is, Jesus said, look for signs in the heavens and in the stars. And specifically, we look to lunar eclipses that have been happening. Maybe many of you participated a number of years back. There was a solar eclipse that happened. I drove down to a baseball game down in Salem just to watch it because I knew the view from down there was going to be more impressive, and it was very neat. But I didn't really have an understanding for the fact that these can be signs from heaven that we should be paying attention to. And the question is how and why. A couple of verses to kind of get us started. From Luke 21, verse 25 through 26. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. And on the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. People fainting from terror, apprehension of what is coming on the world. For the heavenly bodies will be shaken. And in Joel, chapter 2, verse 30 and 31, I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. So before the Lord comes back, we are to look for signs in the heavens, things like eclipses and full moons, and look to what the significance of those may be. So what are the significances? Well, I found a couple that were very interesting. We've talked about before that everything kind of focuses back on Israel, right? That is the center of prophetic time. So what's been going on with respect to signs in the stars in the heavens as it relates to Israel and to the Jewish people? There have been, I found out, 4 successive occurrences of blood moons falling on Jewish holidays. A couple of talks back, we talked about the festivals, right? The spring festivals and the fall festivals, and how we've already recognized all of the spring festivals with the first coming of Christ. The others will be with the second coming. But interestingly enough, in some very, very significant dates in the Jewish history over the last number of years, we have had signs in the stars and the moons. In 1948, we just got done talking about earlier, Israel became a nation, restoring, in quote, the Holy Land. The Holy Land was restored. A tetrad, or 4 successive blood moons, occurred on Jewish holy days on the 2 years subsequent to that event. And that would be over Passover and Tabernacles. So very fascinating that would occur on Jewish holidays. So now you start looking at, well, what other things have happened where we've had these signs in the moons and the stars and the heavens on significant days in the Israel calendar. In 1967, you'll recognize that was the Six-Day War, where the Jewish people restored the unity of Jerusalem. and took Jerusalem back under their control. So they basically rectified and gathered up the holy city. Immediately following that war, for the next 2 years, on successive Jewish holidays of Passover and Tabernacles, we had these blood moons occurring again. Coincidence? Maybe not. The next one to occur on Jewish holidays in a tetrad or a series of 4 was in 2014 and 2015. You might look back and say, well, I don't remember any conflict or any war going on in Israel during that time frame. But what's interesting is that in 14 and 15, preparations for the rebuilding of God's temple began in Israel. So the preparations for that rebuilding of the third temple, again, the Temple Institute of Israel crowdfunded over $100,000 for architectural plans to begin the design in preparation for the building of the third temple. They also began a campaign to raise the first of kosher red heifers. And you might say, well, what does a red heifer have to do with prophecy? Well, red heifers are critical in the use of sacrificing and using the ashes to purify the new temple. So before they can build the new temple, Jewish tradition says we have to have a perfect red heifer sacrificed to bless that new temple. So all of these activities started happening in that time frame immediately following the blood moons of 2014 and 2015. So again, the other thing I found fascinating is, are there any Indiana Jones fans in the room? So if you watched the first Indiana Jones and you saw what goes on, Israeli sources are now claiming they know exactly where the Ark of the Covenant is. Why is that critical? Because the temple is the home for the Ark of the Covenant. Now, if you've watched the movies, you all know, like I do, where it's at. It's in a warehouse, and it's covered up somewhere, and nobody kind of knows where it's at. However, Israeli sources claim that when the time is right to rebuild that temple, we know exactly where that Ark of the Covenant is. It's amazing that it even still exists. It's so old, but when God's involved, I'm sure anything is possible. So stay tuned to see when that happens.
Hey,
Yeah.
I guess last day you saw a document on the red heifers.
Yes.
There are currently 3 in Israel that are the exact age, 2 years and 1 month. And they're going to look at them right now for perfection.
We know that the temple has to be rebuilt, don't we? Because in Revelations it talks about, we studied at the midpoint of the tribulation, at 3.5 year point, the Antichrist will desecrate the site. He will go up there, proclaim himself to be God. And so we know that before that time frame, it has to be built. So again, what's the timing? We don't exactly know, but we should be following these stories with great interest. And then the next question is, when is the next tetrad? The one thing about looking at the stars, and there's great science and precision placed on understanding how moons and stars and the sun align, and they have already scheduled the next and know when the next tetrad will occur on the 4 Jewish holidays again, and it's going to occur in 2032 and 2033. Do we know what the significance of that event is going to be? No, we don't right now, but I'm sure that we need to be paying attention because it has to do with God's plan. We talked about the division of God's land. Israel is under constant pressure to divide their land from the outside, even from our own White House. We have to have a 2-state solution. We have to give the Palestinian people their own homeland. What does God say about dividing his land? From Joel 3, verses 1 and 2. In those days and at that time when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, Israel, I will gather all nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. There I will put them on trial for what they did to my inheritance, my people Israel, because they scattered my people among the nations and divided up my land. Joel 3, verse 1 and 2. So it's God's land. I don't think there's any reason to think otherwise. The Bible tells us it's God's land. And make no mistake about it, creating a Palestinian state, creating a 2-state solution, the White House encouraging a 2-state solution is not in God's plan. So what should we do about it? Well, we should watch very carefully, because as pressures mount to divide the land, Gary.
I read recently too that written by a rabbi saying that geography textbooks of the Muslims in the schools, in their maps.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why a two-state solution would never work anyway. The Palestinian people won't accept a two-state solution. They believe that's their land, and they won't accept it. So the efforts to do this are political in nature. They're not biblical, and they're certainly not going to appease the conflicts in that region. So it's really a lose-lose proposition. But as we start to see these transpiring, we should watch with great interest. Jerry?
You look at all world maps, the area that's Israel was called Palestine.
It was under British rule. It was under British rule. And then when the conflict started, the British basically gave up that land. That's when the Israeli people moved back in and the Jewish state was reborn. But yeah, on old maps, it is called Palestine.
Can you tell me exactly who the Palestinians are?
No.
Yeah, I was listening to Jack Hill briefly, and some people now claiming that Jesus was Palestinian. Well,
Palestinian Jew, he was.
he was a Jew, but he wasn't Palestinian, because Palestine was coming to existence about 350 AD. When Roman general Hadrian invaded Jerusalem and renamed it Palestine, in relation to the Philistines, Israel's enemy. So this is sacred slap in the face. Rename it Palestine.
Very interesting history there. Shifting gears, I found this interesting as well. What did we learn from the story of Babel? Many of you are familiar with the story of Babel from Genesis. Man was speaking the same language. He'd become very powerful. They devised a plan to build this great tower that was going to reach up into the heavens. And God was not happy. Then the Lord said in Genesis 11:6, "Look, they are one people, and they have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." We know how that story ended. God scattered the people, confused them all, and destroyed their plans for greatness at that time. So what is God saying when he looks at the story of Babel and looks at us today? I think the moral of the story is that when man tries to replace or become like God, God's going to intervene. God's not going to be happy with that. I think that happened in Babel. Is it happening again today? What is our Babel today? Could it be these rapid innovations in technology are the new Babel that need to be destroyed? And are we becoming too powerful, too godlike with all of the things going on in biotechnology and cloning and artificial intelligence and so forth? Are we getting too powerful? So let's look at advancements in technology. In order to achieve the one world government and facilitate the mark of the beast that we talked about in Revelation last week, technology has to progress to the degree that we can control people. The Antichrist's plan is all about controlling people, getting them to worship him, creating a one world currency, what we'll talk about in a second. How do those things get achieved by a mere human? Because when the Antichrist comes on the scene, he's human, then he gets possessed by the devil. Technology must play a role in those plans. And again, another reason why 1948 was significant, I think the other significant development that plays into the end times being only possible as we start to get into today is that technology had to catch up. Technology had to get to the point where it could offer the kinds of solutions that are needed to usher in the Antichrist and his world control. So how many people have been studying and hearing about artificial intelligence or playing with some of these tools online that allow you to do things from an artificial intelligence perspective? It's both very, very exciting and very, very frightening what artificial intelligence is claiming to be able to do. And it's just beginning to scratch the surface. It's in its infancy now. It's accelerating very quickly. One intelligent person that was quoted talking about in the know of technology and artificial intelligence said that it'll be a point very, very soon where that technology will allow knowledge to double every 12 hours. That is absolutely scary. The capabilities of 5G. How many people were excited to get a 5G phone when those came out? Because, boy, that's going to make my life easier. I can download things at the speed of light. The 5G technology is a communication process allowing technology to communicate with one another. As that advances and gets to the point where it's as advanced as it is now, the ability to combine artificial intelligence with 5G technology means that there will be lightning speed of intelligence and increase in functionality in no time. There's a special technology I want to mention because I find it particularly interesting. It's called Neuralink. I don't know if anybody's heard of Neuralink. It's a new company by none other than Elon Musk, bringer of Teslas and SpaceX. And we're going to talk about what I find to be so interesting and a little disturbing about that technology here in just a second. Food for thought. In the Old Testament, God wiped out the Nephilim, the giants, during the flood of Noah because he was displeased with the angels that had come down and procreated with humans and created this race that was ruining his vision of the earth. So he destroyed them. Are the new giants tech giants? How many times do we hear about tech giants and how they're ruling the economy right now and ruling technology? Will they usher in the new tribulation? Will Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft have technologies that are controlling our lives, be players as tech giants in the new world? Quick intro to Neuralink here. Watch this very short video and then I want to talk about it for a second.
What are your thoughts on Elon Musk's Neuralink?
This isn't new. It has a new name. It's getting recognition by the news. But honestly, it's been squelched. It's been covered up for many, many decades. I can track back at least synthetic telepathy or piping voices into people's head right around Kennedy's assassination, but about 1958 is the earliest target I could find. I hope Elon actually succeeds, because then this isn't imaginary stuff anymore. People will then say, wow, we can really connect brains together and make hyper intelligence.
What could go wrong? So with Musk's backing, Neuralink has brought a whole lot of resource and attention to brain-computer interfaces. His vision is that everyone's brain will be connected to a computer. If that is going to succeed, think about the ramifications. First of all, they always start out with these innocuous, kind of, oh, it's going to be great for mankind. I think the first thing they've talked about is we can maybe bring the ability to walk to the paralyzed, because we can put a chip in the head that bypasses the spinal cord, the damaged spinal cord, and allows the muscles to react to a brain chip. It sounds fabulous, sounds fantastic, sounds like what we want technology to do. But the other things it's going to be able to do is pipe information into people's heads, to be able to extract information from people's brains. When the Antichrist takes over, we talk about everyone worshiping the Antichrist. There can be no thought dissension. This sounds like Orwellian 1984 stuff, but is it possible that they can control the thoughts people have? And if you're a Christian, can they wipe out those thoughts of being a Christian and implant different thoughts into people's heads? So be very wary if they offer you the ability to get a chip put into your head, because what does that sound like? It kind of sounds like we'll get a mark on our hand, our right hand, or maybe in our forehead that will allow us to do these wonderful things like survive. Could this technology be a precursor or related somehow to the mark of the beast? The answer is we don't know, but I will say it is absolutely creepy. One world government. And we're just going to get to the end here and wrap up here in the next couple of minutes. We talked last week about the Antichrist from Revelation 13:3-4, and this ruler will receive worship from all over the world, and he'll have authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation from Revelation 13:7. This person will be truly the leader of a one world government recognized as sovereign over all other governments. Are we starting to see preparations for the Antichrist coming on the scene? I would argue that we are already seeing the elimination of borders across the world and including in our own country. We're seeing organizations that are giving unprecedented power over sovereign nations now as we speak. During the COVID process that we all went through, the World Health Organization had control over what we did as a country with respect to our response to COVID. So we had a body that wasn't even the United States dictating what the United States could do. And we've had the United Nations for many, many years, and what they try to do in tinkering all over the world and creating world issues that need to be solved and dealt with. The World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the European Union, the collaboration between Europe in the 90s when they all went together and had one currency and kind of gave up their sovereignty, NATO, all these things are precursors to giving up individual country sovereignty and giving it to a world body or a world organization. And the one thing that I saw that made me wonder, is this even spreading more to the United States, is I look at what's going on our southern border. I look at the fact that they've basically created an open border policy. What could possibly be the reason for creating an open border policy? And then I got to thinking, well, maybe one of the goals of that policy is to start to eliminate the borders around North America, consolidating North America like they did in Europe, because as you start to consolidate these countries and taking away their sovereignty, you start getting closer to the ability to kind of piece it all together as a one world government. So these kinds of things may be in the early stages, but they are happening more and more rapidly. And then finally, the cashless society. Has anybody heard of a central bank digital currency? If you've been studying in the news, you know that the United States back in July started its first foray into creating a central bank digital currency. And how many people have had trouble going places and spending cash now? I got to tell you, I've been to more places now that said, I'm sorry, we don't accept cash, we only accept credit cards. Why are they getting rid of cash? They say it's because nefarious things happen when people deal in cash because there's privacy involved. Yeah, that's the whole point. There's privacy involved. Getting rid of that is a necessary step, perhaps, to ushering in the mark of the beast. Once everybody has no cash to spend, once everybody is on a common currency that is controlled by a government entity, your lack of privacy becomes very apparent. And even scarier, they say that not only will every transaction you have be transparent to the government, but they may be able to turn off your ability to spend money if you buy things that they don't approve of. I think there's a lot of people now, and I'm not suggesting that everybody become a gun-toting Second Amendment person, but think about the time when the government may say, we're no longer going to allow you to buy a handgun or buy bullets for that handgun, or we're not going to allow you to buy certain things because you're saying things in social media that we don't necessarily approve of. The power that we have now is we have autonomy in our ability to spend money. In the future, that autonomy is going to go away. The IMF's Kristalina Georgieva said in a public sector should keep preparing to deploy these central bank digital currencies and related payment platforms in the future. So there's advocation of all of these, again, world organizations to say this isn't just going to be the United States, but the whole world is going to move towards this cashless mentality. How convenient to go towards a cashless mentality and see technology rise. Because when we look at Revelation 13:15, everyone, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, will be forced to receive some type of mark or maybe technology on their right hands or their foreheads in order to buy and sell, Revelation 13:16. And no doubt a majority of the people are going to have to do it, right? Those that study their Bible, and all of us will be gone, but those that are in the tribulation better take heed as to what the outcome is if they decide to take that mark and worship the beast. But I start to see now, and I think maybe you can see that process of getting to a cashless society could be a precursor as well to what Revelation says.
David, you hear a lot of talk about implants being marked with ink?
I am hearing that the possibility that the technology exists now.
But it's technical, think it for what you want.
Yep.
I read recently comment that this says right here, mark on, not in.
On? Yeah.
Take that for what it may or may not be.
Right, right. People thought years ago when we first had barcodes on the scene that everybody was going to get a barcode. That could be on the skin, and you were going to scan your hand as you went through the checkout line. Beep, beep, right? People thought that could be what it is. I don't think anybody knows. All I'm suggesting is technology has advanced at such a rapid clip, and the technology exists now that all of those things are possible.
Well, I think I saw recently where in Europe, they are already hand implants allow you to scan.
Yep. That technology is here. Final thoughts on this incredibly uplifting topic that we're talking about today.
No longer
Yeah, that Neuralink was particularly disturbing to me because if they can control how you think, they can control how you act. So some scary stuff. So again, just some final thoughts as we talked about. Again, many generations thought we were in the end times. We talked a little bit about why that's probably not possible when we're still here. Yet Bible prophecy unfulfilled had made that impossible. Now that Israel's been regathered and technology has advanced, I think it behooves all of us to think a little bit more about, are we getting closer to that time? And if so, what are we doing about it? Well, for one, we should be celebrating, as Christians, celebrating Maranatha we talked about last week, come Jesus come. Paradise comes when Jesus comes. I mean, that's what we should all want. But we should be looking up, and even if the time isn't today, maybe it's in 2 years, 2 months, 20 years, we don't know for sure. But be ready. Be ready for the Son of Man to come back when least expected. That's what it says in Matthew 25:44. So,
Seems like I'm seeing more references to signs in the heavens, sunspots, sun activity, asteroids, comets I haven't seen before.
yeah.
Maybe we just have the technology to see it.
Yeah, that, and I don't think people really paid as much attention as they should have, right? Didn't understand that. But thank you, everyone. So next week, yeah.
What is this?
Oh, I'm going to get to that. Next week is our final week, the thought-provoking prophecies. Next week isn't going to be all biblical. I know we've been sticking very much to a biblical basis for what we're talking about, but next week we're going to have some fun with some other theories and philosophies and prophecies that are out there. On that very last page, extra credit for those that are interested in Signs from the Stars, it would have taken me way too long to go through this. Look that up in your computers, the 23rd of September 2017, as it relates to Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. A very significant astrological event took place that is almost frightening in terms of how closely it matches biblical prophecy. So we can talk about that maybe next week. Take a look at that, and we'll discuss that next time. So thanks, everyone.